Hello. This lecture will talk about culture and language and their role in the reproduction of social inequality, which is to say, the ways that culture and language seem to make inequalities appear to be justified or legitimate or even natural. So I'm going to go to the screen share, pull up the PowerPoint, and start from here. So we're going to start with looking at the concept of culture, which, as we'll see, is a very complicated word with a long history in which it has come to mean very different things. Um, then we will delve into the concept of cultural appropriation, which is, a more current and kind of controversial concept, and the role that cultural appropriation plays in the social reproduction of inequality. And we'll then move on to thinking about the relationship between culture and language. In this early part of the lecture, we'll introduce some famous and influential works by sociologists and people who are sociology adjacent, we might say. I'll talk about Edward Said's book, Orientalism, which is very influential. Doesn't come out of sociology, but out of literary theory and literary criticism, but has had a lot of impact among sociologists. And then also the books by Erving Goffman and Pierre Bourdieu, both of whom were sociologists with a great influence within the discipline. And then finally, towards the second half of the lecture, we'll look at some of the readings from the course material that have to do with popular culture and the politics of representation, specifically the way that different racial and ethnic groups have been represented in the media, often in very stereotypical and degrading ways, which makes their inequality appear to be natural and justified and legitimate. So we begin with the concept of culture. A literary theorist named Raymond Williams basically tracked the history of how the word culture has been used and concluded that culture is one of the two or three most complicated words in the whole English language. And the reason for that complication is that the word's definition has changed several times over the course of history. So if we go back to the 15th century, the oldest definition of culture defined, when people talked about culture, they meant it as a process of growth or cultivation to tend or cultivate something like crops or animals. Here, the root with the word agriculture, comes into play. So this earliest definition was of to help something sort of grow and cultivate. This was eventually in the late 18th century. This use of the word was then extended towards talking about human development in terms of growth, in terms of human development through art, philosophy, literature, music, theater, and so forth. These forms of culture that were intended to help people grow smarter, more aesthetically in tuned, more spiritually adept, I suppose one could say. And so this notion of culture was therefore like inherently elitist. Was linked with the upper classes and an educated elite, basically like only the best music, theater, literature, and so forth, was considered to be culture. The word culture became synonymous with to be civilized and the whole notion of civilization. So that's sort of the root of where this word kind of started out. And then by the 19th and 20th century, it kind of takes on a different meaning with, especially with the emergence of anthropology as a social science, anthropology being the study of cultures around the world. Culture came to be redefined in this period in its connection with language, religion, rituals, and symbols, and other common practices of daily life. So, in this definition, culture describes a particular way of life, expressing meanings and values, not just in art and educational activities, but in ordinary behavior and institutions. It's a much less elitist definition of culture. In other words, culture in this definition is something that is shared by all members of a group. It's not linked to this ideal of human growth or aesthetic hierarchies that are only the property of the best works of art and music, etc. So culture came to be thought of as like embodied in objects and artifacts which represent the shared beliefs and values of a particular group, like in a museum or in a time capsule. So we still to this day sometimes hear used culture invoked in this older, more elitist kind of way, but really the dominant meaning of the word has now taken on this more um, accessible ideal of something that is shared by all members of a group, and it's taken on a more kind of neutral sense with regard to whether it's the best or whether it helps people grow smarter and better. Um, Now, in these days, people use this term a fair amount, cultural appropriation, and we're going to sort of come back to it at different points in the lecture. Cultural appropriation occurs when members of a dominant group adopt cultural elements of an oppressed group in an exploitative, disrespectful, or stereotypical way. And so the examples, that we especially see in being called out in social media and so forth today, that in those instances, cultural appropriation often includes the exploitation of another culture's religious and cultural traditions, dance steps, fashion, symbols, language, music, and so forth. There is no easy or fast way to really determine whether or not something is cultural appropriation or whether it's more like cultural appreciation. It really depends on the social context. It's a context dependent definition, and specifically, it's about the power relationships involved in who's appropriating and who's being appropriated, the relative power or relative powerlessness of the people involved and the cultures that are being represented. So ultimately, this is a question that has to do with the power relations in society. Um, Common examples of cultural appropriation that we see include sports teams using Native American tribal names and images as mascots. We'll have more to say about this later in the lecture. Um, people not from the originating culture wearing jewelry or fashion that incorporates religious symbols without any belief in the religion behind them, or wearing items of deep cultural significance and status that have to be earned, like a Native American headdress, for example. Um, so, in particularly in the context of the United States of American society, what has been especially prevalent has been this phenomenon of white people adopting elements of Black culture, and especially in music, in style, in language, like in slang, and in fashion and dance and all of these various cultural elements. We see a long history of what people today call cultural appropriation. Really, the minstrel shows, the sort of the blackface minstrelsy of the 19th century, which I talked about in a previous lecture, that can really be considered the original form of cultural appropriation. In the 20th century, cultural appropriation took the form of the so-called white Negro in the jazz and swing music scenes in the 1920s and 30s. So there was a lot of appropriation of like not just the music, but the slang and the dress and the attitude, of the jazz culture in the 20s and 30s. It was later seen in, like the hipster archetype of the 1940s, in rock and roll, and the beatnik culture of the 1950s, and more, recently with hip hop, since, the 1980s and 90s. So we certainly could add many more examples than to that. But that, I think, gives us a pretty a decent definition and handful of examples to work with when thinking about this concept of cultural appropriation. Um, so the book that I wanted to kind of introduce here that is relevant for a lot of these issues around culture and language and inequality, and will also be relevant to what we'll have to say towards the end of the lecture, is this book called Orientalism. It's a book from 1978 by a Palestinian scholar named Edward W. Said. Um, it's a book in which the author establishes the term as a critical concept to describe the West's commonly contemptuous depiction and portrayal of the East, i.e., the so-called Orient. What's not called the Orient so much anymore, but was for much of the 19th and 20th century, and that is generally the people who inhabit Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East. You may recognize this mural that I've used in the slide here. It's from San Francisco State. We have one of the few murals having to do with anybody Palestinian on any campus in the U.S. That this mural is right over the entrance to the bookstore. The term Orientalism denotes a kind of an exaggeration of difference. And along with that comes the presumption of Western superiority, the application of cliched analytical models for perceiving the so-called Oriental world. And these cultural representations typically depict this part of the world, the so-called Orient, as primitive, irrational, violent, despotic, fanatic, and essentially inferior to the West. In a word, more savage and uncivilized. So, in this sort of presumed thinking, this dominant style of thinking, the Enlightenment can only occur when traditional and reactionary values are replaced by contemporary and progressive ideas that are either Western or Western influenced. So Edward Said in his book sort of called out all of these examples throughout history and especially in literature and culture where we see these kinds of stereotypical depictions of people in this, in this region of the world. And I think to this day, his analysis of Orientalism still continues to find, if he were alive today, I think he would still continue to find many examples of this. And I believe he would say that this kind of Orientalist attitude has gone a long way towards, say, justifying the occupation and genocide of people in Gaza and the West Bank. He himself being Palestinian, and Said had been part of a number of the resistance struggles during his lifetime. He's no longer with us, but he was alive through much of the late 20th century and part of those struggles against the Israeli occupation. So his idea, that idea of Orientalism kind of, I think is one that continues to have a lot of current relevance. In turning to look to language, language is, of course, a crucial language element of all cultures. And indeed, the common use of a particular language is often the thing that defines a culture. As sociologists, we generally argue that language is not simply a medium of description and communication, but instead it is something that actively contributes to the social construction of reality. Another way of saying this is that language frames and therefore shapes reality. The words we use and the stories that we tell do not passively reflect reality, but rather actively constitute it. So this is the importance of language for, not just being like a window onto the world, not just a reflection of the world, but something that actually shapes and helps to create our social world. And so therefore language is quite powerful in the way that it exerts coercion and control. Language can be used to control because it can shape a positive, neutral, or negative reality for oneself and for others. And we will also see examples here of how language can also make power invisible, how language can contribute to the reproduction of inequality by concealing or naturalizing the power relationships in society. So this is a topic that is taken up in one of your readings from the social construction of inequality and difference. The title of the reading is Making Systems of Privilege Visible. And the author's argument is basically has to do with how systems of privilege are rendered invisible in language, how they are concealed by language. So the invisibility of privilege is something that strengthens the power it creates and maintains. It allows the powerful to sort of hide behind this smoke screen of language. And resistance becomes impossible when privilege is made invisible. We can't even, identify the power relationships, much less struggle against them. And so as a result, privilege is allowed to perpetuate, regenerate, and recreate itself. The way that language comes into play in doing this is that language veils the existence of privilege by making it a norm, i.e., to seem normal, whereas non privileged groups are seen as abnormal or depicted, therefore, as abnormal. So the characteristics and attributes of the privileged groups are seen as societal norms, like this is just the way things are and this is just the way things should be. And a very common example in American society is around whiteness. Whiteness in the US is consistently upheld as the social norm with which people of color are compared and measured against. So this is one of many examples that the authors draw upon to illustrate these ways in which systems of power and privilege are made to seem invisible in language and in the culture at large. Another example of this would be the use of passive voice. In language, passive voice is often used in media reports in ways that remove agency and responsibility from those carrying out an action, particularly when they involve powerful actors like the police, the government, or a corporation. So what the passive voice does is that it essentially deflects responsibility, it sort of changes the focus to focus on the recipient or the victim of an event, and obscures or makes invisible the actions of the doer, the actor in the event. And so I think, like, a pretty good example of this coming from the Los Angeles Police Department, where they talk about the suspect produced an article that resembled a handgun, at which time an officer involved shooting occurred. The suspect was struck by gunfire and transported to a local hospital with non-life-threatening injuries. No officers were injured during the incident. So it's like, now in this kind of passive voice, you see that, like, the suspect becomes the subject of the first two sentences. They become the actor. They're getting struck by gunfire as opposed to, the police shot someone, which is really what's going on in this tweet. Instead, with this sort of passive voice, now the sort of onus is on the suspect. They become the subject of the sentence, and the role of the police in shooting this person is obfuscated. We see this all the time. It's an officer involved shooting. Well, it was like, who was involved, and who got shot and what happened. All of those things are obfuscated. So this is a relatively commonplace example that we see in media reports. Another example is like, a Black man died in police custody. Hey, well, how did they die? And what did the fact that they were in police custody have to do with it? We see this now in the war in in Palestine, in the Middle East, with the reporting, that, like, for example, Palestinians were killed in clashes rather than Israeli forces killed Palestinians. This is the kind of language that shields Israel from scrutiny, and it also, like, obscures the reason why so many Palestinians would be angry at Israel. It just makes it seem like, oh, just these people are just fighting for like no apparent reason. There's just like this clash. And it sort of obfuscates all of the social relationships of power that went into creating that event. It makes it just seem like, oh well, shit happens, like just these, it kind of clouds reality, and especially like the power dimensions of reality. So I mentioned this author, at least in the beginning of the lecture, Irving Goffman, who is really a very well-known sociologist, especially like in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And one of his last book, I think it actually is his very last book before he died in 1982, was called Frame Analysis. And in sociology, frame analysis comprises a set of concepts and theoretical perspectives on how individuals, groups, and societies organize, perceive, and communicate about reality. In other words, how do we frame reality? How do we make sense of what happens in the real world by putting a kind of frame around it in the same way that one would put a frame around a picture? When you put a frame around a picture, it emphasizes what's in the frame, but it also, kind of marginalizes anything that's outside of the frame so that you're not focused on what's going on outside the frame. That, part is made invisible or, at least, kind of fuzzy and undetectable. So framing can manifest in thought or interpersonal communication. Frames in thought consist of the mental representations, interpretations, and simplifications of reality. In other words, framing is something that we all do, and to some extent, like we have to do it in order to make sense of our world and to make meaning. But the question is like kind of how then does like power relationships shape what we frame and what we leave out of the frame? In social theory, framing is a schema of interpretation, a collection of anecdotes and stereotypes that people rely on to understand and respond to events. In other words, people build a series of mental filters and then use these filters to make sense of the world. The choices they then make are influenced by their creation of a frame. So again, framing is something that we all have to do in order to kind of like organize experience. But we have to attend to what we choose to put in the frame and what we choose to leave out. The eminent sociologist Irving Goffman, whose dramaturgical method examines society as a form of performative theater, pioneered the use of frame analysis in his 1974 book of the same title, which theorized the organization of experience. So this was kind of at the end of Goffman's long career of sociological research, in which he was, especially interested in how people kind of like perform roles and almost looking at society as a kind of like a kind of a theater, in the sense of like Shakespeare saying that all the world's a stage, that we are all kind of like performing roles, and that those roles have a certain kind of script that we need to at least loosely kind of follow in order to give a convincing performance. And so Goffman kind of looked at society as this kind of ongoing sort of theater in this way. It yields a number of very interesting insights. The other sociologist that has had a big influence more recently is named Pierre Bourdieu, and among his very many books is one called Language and Symbolic Power. And here, I would say more so than Irving Goffman, Bourdieu was concerned with issues of power and inequality and their connection with language and symbols and culture in general. Bourdieu argues that language should be viewed not only as a means of communication, but also as a medium of power, as like an exercise of power. And this is a consistent theme running through all of his sociological works. He's very interested in the connection between culture and power. He coined the term symbolic violence in order to describe how social inequalities and hierarchies are maintained and reproduced through language and other symbolic forms of domination. So these ways in which, like, as we've been saying throughout this lecture, the way that language especially contributes to the reproduction of inequality and hierarchy and power. Bourdieu examines how linguistic usage varies according to social hierarchies like class and gender. And he also opens a new approach to the way language is used in the domain of politics. Like, for example, what we were saying in the previous slide about the use of passive voice as a political instrument in using language to get the powers that be off the hook and to place responsibility instead onto the victims or the recipient of action by the powerful. So now we turn to thinking about these examples from popular culture. And we'll be drawing here from the articles in the Social Construction of Difference and Inequality. And these are articles that generally have to do with cultural forms like advertising, like Hollywood film, professional sports. These are all huge multi-billion-dollar industries. And they broadcast their imagery, increasingly around the world. They have sort of a global reach, and so it's useful to think about the role that these forms of media play, not just in reproducing inequality here in this society, but around the world. And so we look here at Deborah Merskin's article called Winnebagos, Cherokees, Apaches, and Dakotas, the Persistence of Stereotyping of American Indians in American Advertising Brands. And so, in the article, she looks at a whole plethora of examples from the history of advertising and how they reproduced these stereotypical images of Native Americans, how those images were created and used in advertising, and how they perpetuated stereotypes. And these images, she says, build on long-standing assumptions about Native Americans among whites and reinforce an ideology that has resulted in many consumers failing to see this as a form of racism. So these kinds of advertisements, I think you wouldn't really see them much today. They would be rightfully called out and certainly subject to some sort of shaming publicly. But they were very commonplace throughout most of the 20th century. It was very commonplace to see, tobacco or any of these other products kind of sold in these sorts of with this sorts of imagery attached to them. One of the examples that is more current or more enduring is from the Land O'Lakes butter. And Merskin in the article talks about how this young woman on the package is associated with youth, innocence, nature, and purity. The result is the generic Indian maiden, and the qualities stereotypically associated with this beaded, buckskin, doe-eyed young woman are transferred to the company's products. And Merskin in the article talks about this as part of a larger phenomenon that is often called the noble savage image. The noble savage image is extended to, in this case, include the female stereotype. So a noble savage is basically a literary stock character you can find in all kinds of American popular fiction and stories, going back to, like the 17th and 18th century. Had, the noble savage is a kind of a stock character in a lot of literary dramas that were set in North America. And so this noble savage embodies the concept of the indigene, the outsider, the wild human, the savage part, right? The noble savage is an other who has not been corrupted by civilization and therefore symbolizes humanity's innate goodness, but in this way that's really kind of patronizing and makes native people out to be kind of like less than human, to be, almost like, childlike and primitive. Uh, where we especially see a lot of this stuff is in sports, and particularly college sports and college football. U.S. colleges and universities once regularly would name their team mascots after Native Americans. This was very commonplace throughout the 20th century. So, for example, you see here the Stanford University here in Palo Alto. Their mascot was the Stanford Indians all the way until 1972. There you see on the top, what the mascot for like the sports teams and everything looked like, this sort of angry Indian figure. And then you see like on the bottom, it looks probably some sort of like, dance or homecoming or graduation ceremony or whatever. But the Stanford students used to regularly dress up like in, with feathers in their hair and, in all kinds of like Native American signifying clothing. And that was until the early 70s. Since 2005, the NCAA has had formal restrictions against naming teams after Native American tribes. But the most prominent example that's discussed in your reading by Dave Zirin is about the Florida State Seminoles, who Zirin calls the champions of racist mascots. It's one of the last remaining universities that continues to use a tribe as its mascot, and also continues to do, all kinds of like using Native American imagery and rituals and things like that are kind of embedded into the whole Florida State, especially the college football team is very, historically like very good. I don't know how they're doing right now, but historically they've been, among one of the sort of powerhouse college football teams. Zirin in the article describes the team's game day ritual, in which a white person with face smeared with war paint, rides on a horse dressed as the legendary Chief Osceola, while thousands of overwhelmingly Caucasian fans with feathers in their hair do the tomahawk chop and whoop war chants. This continues to happen to this day. You do see it in some other sports teams, like the Atlanta Braves baseball team, or there's other examples that continue to endure. It used to be more of a commonplace thing, but to this day, like the Atlanta Braves fans during like a rally will start doing this tomahawk chop thing where they start, as if they're chanting Native Americans, and doing this kind of thing with their, like a tomahawk chop with their hands. Now the defenders argue that the use of the mascot is legitimate because what they say is that, well, Florida State University has an agreement with the Seminole Nation. But Zirin looks into this, and he shows that the agreement is with the Florida Seminole Tribal Council and not the Seminole Nation. The fact is, the majority of the Seminoles don't live in Florida, but rather they live in Oklahoma, which is a direct result of the Seminole Wars, the Indian Removal Act, and the Trail of Tears that followed the Indian Removal Act, in which, basically Native people from all sorts of different tribes were basically pushed west across the Mississippi River into reservations on, kind of less fertile land, less valuable land, where, to this day, many of those communities remain. Now, the Oklahoma Seminoles, who form the majority of the Seminole tribe in the United States, they oppose Florida State's use of the name, and they passed a resolution to that effect in 2013. But this Florida Seminole Tribal Council, Zirin looks into, that supposedly approves of this. Zirin looks into it and finds that they're actually just like the owner of this series of luxury casino hotels throughout the state of Florida, where this Seminole brand is prominently on display. So these people that are speaking for Seminoles across the country are actually just like a group of hotel casino owners. And so for that wealthy and powerful Florida Seminole tribal leaders, this cultural elevation of the football program is a part of their extremely lucrative gaming operation. Their branding, their merchandising, this whole kind of thing that's especially prevalent around college football in the South. The fact of the matter is that the gambling doesn't benefit the vast majority of Native Americans. Don't benefit from these casino or gambling operations. The wealth from them flows into a very small number of hands. As we've seen in previous lectures, the majority of Native Americans to this day languish in very dire poverty. That still is the highest poverty rates in the whole country of any group, and especially on reservations, with reservation poverty listed as around 50% in the latest census. Zirin also, goes in and digs into who was this real the real Chief Osceola. We see, Osceola being depicted here in this game day football ritual. But who was the real person? He says, Zion, that basically another example of like cultural appropriation that really grossly distorts the actual history of the Seminoles. The real Chief Osceola was a resistance fighter and a leader of the Second Seminole War in Florida against the U.S. government, roughly during like the 1830s, around that period. And Zion, quotes from this text to say that Osceola became an international symbol of the Seminole Nation's refusal to surrender. He was a renowned public speaker and a fierce fighter who was also an opponent of the U.S. slave system. One of his two wives was a woman of African descent, and it was not uncommon for escaped slaves to become a part of the Seminole Nation. Osceola's army frustrated the entire U.S. government, five separate army generals at a cost to the U.S. Treasury of more than $20 million. And then on October 21st, 1837, Osceola met with U.S. government officials to discuss a peace treaty. When he arrived, he was captured and imprisoned. So this is a person who, in reality, led this longstanding, ongoing fight against the U.S. government, who aligned himself with the plight of the enslaved people in the South, where there was this kind of crossover between escaped slaves and the Seminole people. This is known, these are known as like maroon communities in different parts of North and South America. This where you have like kind of escaped slaves and indigenous people forming these kinds of communities of resistance. And he held out for a long time and gave the U.S. government hell until they eventually just basically tricked him into being captured and put in prison. So I think Zyron's point is just that knowing this kind of history, it just adds so much insult to injury in the way that the Florida State uses this Seminole brand and these kinds of all these rituals in their game day football performances. The second article that we look at also from the text on social construction of inequality and difference has to do with Asian American media representation. So this is a study that investigated representations of Asian Americans in films, in like Hollywood movies over the past 25 years. And here again, we see that these are replete with stereotyping. And the stereotyping includes emasculated men, martial artists, timid women, nerdy sidekicks, characters for comic relief, sadistic aggressors, perpetual foreigners, family-focused characters without any other nuanced characteristics, and overly strict parental figures. These are, in other words, the most common roles for Asian American people in Hollywood films. There's a sort of a fairly limited set of stereotyped roles that people are cast into. So while more diverse representations of Asian Americans has increased in recent years, they conclude that there is still a lot of room for improved positive stereotype resisting representations. So, again, things have changed. They've gotten better to some degree, and people are perhaps a little bit more aware than they used to be. And yet, they're, as the authors conclude, there's still a lot of room for improvement. So the other part of this article has to do with what they call identity development and the implications for identity development in terms of the consequences of these stereotypes. And so they argue that there's this a danger of negative social mirroring and an internalization of the stereotypical portrayals of one's own racial group. And this, is something that is really kind of applicable to all groups. The danger that basically people are going to grow up seeing these kinds of images, and they're going to internalize that. They're going to internalize those kinds of stereotypes of themselves and of the group that they're part of. So these stereotypical representations can reinforce negative attitudes and behaviors from out-group members, which is to say from people who are either part of the dominant group or people who are part of other minority groups, can have these negative attitudes and stereotypical ideals towards Asian Americans. The exposure to media representations that confirm stereotypes of Asian Americans can thus promote problematic intergroup behavior in the form of discrimination, microaggressions, and othering. Another key finding of the study was that representations of Asian characters differed greatly based on gender. So now they kind of break down in the article, like what kinds of characters or what kinds of roles are typically set out for male and female Asian American characters in these movies. And so Asian male stereotypes were generally presented in a very contrasting way, leaning toward nerdiness or extreme athleticism in the case of martial arts films. But the common trait, what remained common among these characters was their emasculated traits, their exhibited lack of masculinity. And this is a racial stereotype of Asian American men that can negatively affect self-esteem and body image, these very important aspects of identity formation, what they're in the article, what they're calling identity development. If people kind of internalize this imagery and this kind of limited representation, then it can have like these real world consequences for people growing up, if they have in fact if this has shaped their identity. Asian female characters, on the other hand, as they say, more frequently played the role of a romantic interest, or the object of romantic interest, while Asian males rarely served the romantic interest role. So again, that kind of goes into the emasculation, the seeing of Asian American men as like less than real men. So these gendered representations are also present for the female characters, and the results that they found suggested that there was this common trope of timid, soft-spoken Asian women who required the assistance of influence of a white male character in order to gain confidence. Most of these female characters were physically petite, and their physical build conformed to the conventionally attractive slim body weight. They also looked at the ages of the Asian actors that are represented in these films, and found that they too were differed by gender. The female actors' ages were mostly skewed towards younger ages, between say 10 to 30 years old, while male actors were more evenly distributed across the wide age range. So, generally speaking, the Asian female characters that are in these films tend to be sort of smaller and younger and like more passive and dependent in the way that they are depicted in films. And then the third article by John Ronson talks about stereotypes of Arab men in this article that is cleverly titled "You May Know Me from Such Roles as Terrorist Number 4." To again talk about the way that Arab men are stereotypically typecast in Hollywood films, and most often in this kind of like terroristic kind of role that we see here, and this he says, that this kind of stereotyping shifted significantly following the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. So especially in the first few years after 9/11, you had a whole spate of movies that were set with um, Arab American or Arab characters as the bad guys, as the evildoers, and again with a lot with what Saeed had talked about, like as savage, as like uncivilized, as barbaric. Those were the stereotypes that were most commonly in play. And the author says that basically it ramps up after 9/11, but you can see it long before for the previous 100 years. You can see this in Hollywood films. You can see it, like, for example, in the bottom left quadrant here, a scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark. These same kinds of depictions of savagery time and time again. And the study that really looked into this, again, long before 9/11, was the study called Real Bad Arabs: How Hollywood Vilifies a People. It's a book, and then it was made into a documentary film by Jack Shaheen, which analyzes how Hollywood corrupts or manipulates this image of Arabs. And so the documentary looks at 1,000 films that were produced going all the way back to 1896 until 2000. So again, all before 9/11, and looking at these films that have Arab and Muslim characters, and basically Shaheen found that like the great majority, 936 of these titles, so like 94% of them were negative in their portrayal. Shaheen argues that this image is typically characterized by showing Arabs as either as bandits or as a savage, nomadic race. It shows Arab women often as like shallow belly dancers who are serving evil, naive, and greedy Arab sheiks. This was a common Hollywood trope, as you see here in this movie poster for a movie called The Sheik, starring Rudolph Valentino, going back to the 1920s. This kind of portrayal was deeply embedded in this culture. And again, I think we need to think about like how that enduring idea, that enduring stereotype, that enduring misrepresentation continues to inform continues to shape people's understandings of, you know, the occupation and genocide that's going on in Palestine, to this day. The idea that these are like kind of, savage, uncivilized people that, don't deserve this land, and have to make room for these superior, enlightened Westerners. In his Hollywood, in his overview of these pre 9/11 representations in Hollywood movies, Shaheen finds four consistent stereotypes. The bad Arab character that is always evil and portrayed as a terrorist, causing explosions, shootings, stabbings, offenses, and attacks. Just the people that are just depicted as like just violent for like no reason. They just like love violence, and are just waiting to commit acts of violence at any instigation. Then he talks about the shallow or silly Arab character that is always naive, pursuing only fun, lust, and extravagance, like we see here with the sheik in the movie Cannonball Run. The Bedouin Arab character that is remotely far from civilization and science, and is often accompanied by tent and camel images. So, like the uncivilized, sort of pre-modern Orientalist view of these characters. And then finally, the arrogant Arab character that is very nervous, repressive of women, and the farthest possible from emotions or romance. Shaheen reserves his a lot of his analysis for this film that is probably the most popular within this kind of Orientalist genre, which is Disney's Aladdin from 1992. And Disney's animated version of Aladdin was the highest grossing film of 1992, earning $346 million in worldwide box office revenue. But it was enormously controversial. Many people were alarmed by the film's stereotypes and generalizations about Arabs and the Middle East. So the example that from the film that Shaheen talks about is the opening song called "Arabian Nights," was altered following complaints from the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. The lyrics were changed in July 1993 from what they had originally been, which was where they cut off your ear if they don't like your face. That was the lyric that was in the original release, again, connoting this kind of like uncivilized, savage violence of people cutting off ears. So they took that out. But the subsequent line they kept in, which was "It's barbaric, but hey, it's home." That was left intact. Roger Ebert, the film critic, one of the most famous film critics in the history of film criticism, wrote that one distraction during the film was its odd use of ethnic stereotypes. Most of the Arab characters have exaggerated facial characteristics, hooked noses, glowering brows, thick lips. But Aladdin and the princess look like white American teenagers. So the concluding thought that I want to kind of leave you with is again to think about how these depictions continue to have real world impacts. Again, these are not things that simply reflect or depict reality. These are representations that actually continue to shape reality, that continue to like dehumanize entire populations of people, makes it easier to, bomb and kill them, or to, occupy and imprison them, because they're seen as, kind of less than human, and to be seen as like, backwards and or savage. So the kind of the continuing theme of the whole lecture has just been about how, whether it's language or whether it's about this kind of media imagery, these things have real world impacts in reproducing the forms of social inequality that we've been talking about this whole semester. I will leave you with that. And in the next lectures, we'll be moving forward to thinking about social movements and matters related to that. Okay, thank you. Stop the share and see you next time. Bye.